And at the end of the day, the policies and procedures that you implement, the biggest aspect that I saw about it is the culture aspect. I mean, that policy that gets signed off on top makes the person already that's working on the floor where the tacky hits the tar, um, it makes that person feel appreciated. And that is what policies does at the end of the day.
Hello and welcome to this edition of My Safety Hub, where we delve into the world of health and safety. Today we're joined by Eric Puertas and JD Roux, both operations managers for MAKROSAFE Holdings and are responsible for multiple provinces' operations in South Africa. Welcome Eric and JD. Today we'll be discussing the importance of health and safety policies in the workplace and why they need to be enforced and implemented to create such a safe workplace for the employees. JD and Eric, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump straight into the questions. How do you recommend we implement and enforce health and safety policies with our clients or from your experience with your clients?
Hi, Ockert. Thank you so much for asking that question. It's quite an important question to ask because the whole health and safety system actually is driven through the health and safety policies. Now, if we look at the health and safety policies, one always needs to start at the employer, so the highest authority person in the workplace. That would be your CEO, could be a managing director, or it could be the owner of the business. And you need to get that owners or CEO or managing directors buy-in into the policy itself. So if there's no buy-in from top management level, then there won't be any enforcement going down when the implementation of the actual policy starts. So that would be the first step, is to get the employers buy-in into the policy, get them to amend the policy like they see fit for their actual business and operations. And then from there, once the policy is then signed off and approved, then you can actually start communicating the policy.
So it's very much a top-down strategy, making sure that if you get the commitment at the top or the buy-in at the top, other people will follow suit as well.
That is correct. It shows management commitment, and the employees would see that, and then from there they would most likely buy into the policy once it's communicated.
I see. Eric, what strategies would you suggest we then use to ensure that all employees understand the importance of health and safety policies in the workplace?
Thanks a lot, Oki. Yes, there's luckily there's multiple ways to do this. I mean, we're currently in South Africa, which is an education entity out there, and there's so many ways that you can actually communicate, enforce, as well as train your employees on it. I mean, induction trainings is one of the most renowned methods being used out by all the organizations outside. You can do different workshops with your employees, communication sessions. The lovely thing about the policies as well is that you can display them. And the other nice part of it is that you don't necessarily have to display the policy itself. I mean, in the policy, there is an annexure format, which is a shorter version for easy reading, easy understanding, if you look at displaying it in your workshops, your offices, and so forth. Another method that I like to use as well is the hierarchy of control communication perspective. So that is where you actually use the different persons in the different job roles that they've got in the company. So for example, like JD indicated, the MD, director, CEO, let them communicate it to the different managers, train the different managers on it. If you've got supervisors, let those managers train your supervisors, and your supervisors train the employees underneath. And that is also a very nice method to use. Other methods as well is get your health and safety committee educated on it. I mean, they assist a lot in your health and safety system, implementation, all those kind of aspects. So use your health and safety committee. Educated as well as your she-reps. Use them to assist in educating and implementing those policies on the floor, there where the tech hits the top. So there's different methods that you can use to educate your employees on the importance of the safety policies.
If I hear you correctly, what you're saying is the implementation of whatever policy you're busy with isn't something that needs to be isolated and that gets stuck with only the committee, or it's only applicable to one or two persons with a single job role. It's something that has to be enforced throughout the entire organization.
It needs to be implemented, it needs to be monitored, and it needs to be followed by the entire organization. I mean, your employees is just as good as the MD, your MD is just as good as the employee with regards to health and safety in the company. So get everyone involved, and by doing that, you're educating them, you're promoting a health and safety culture. And I mean, that's what the policies does at the end of the day. It focuses on culture.
I think this is also then where corporate governance comes in. Because if we're speaking of the entire organization, we've got to look at how the organization is governed, how is it managed, and good corporate governance is essential towards having a healthy organization, a safe organization, a profitable organization. So how do we ensure that the health and safety policies are given adequate attention with our clients? So how would you go about making sure that you assist your clients from a good corporate governance perspective in terms of health and safety?
Oh, that's actually a very, very good question, okay. So if you take good corporate governance, it's normally a system by which companies are directed and controlled. That's corporate governance. And that's exactly how the PPP is set out. You look at policy, procedure, practices, top to bottom. Approval, getting it line specific towards your other organizations' requirements, needs, standards, and then implementing it from there. So how we, for example, assist in the implementation of it is we start, as JD indicated, at the top. Get those policies signed, communicated, and in line with the rest of your organization standards. Get them approved. Once they're approved, accepted by the organization, we can then always look at assisting you with the implementation on the procedure aspect. I mean, the procedure explains to you exactly how to implement those different sections in the policies. So we then normally assist with the implementation of that. But the most important part of it as well is the fact that a person mustn't forget monitoring and maintaining of the policies and procedures. I mean, we've had several instances where a person, for example, would create the risk assessment, place the risk assessment, or approve the policy, risk assessment, get it up, drafted, approved, everything. For a year long, it would stand in the file, not being given attention to. And I mean, that's where we then assist on monitoring and maintaining those policies, the implementation aspects of those policies on a daily, weekly, monthly, annual basis. So it needs to be continuously monitored and maintained. And I mean, the procedure makes provision for that.
How do the practices play a role in this regard?
In depth. So the practices goes more in depth into the procedure itself. But the biggest aspect that we bring in from a practice perspective as well as is the culture. So we've got different methods of how to motivate, monitor, and promote the health and safety culture. I mean, every person would like to go to an organization or a company where you work and you feel safe. And how do you do that? By implementing a positive health and safety culture. And that is what the practice does at the end of the day. It gets that culture driven among all employees.
I'm guessing that your biggest hurdle in this regard would be to have clients that are reluctant to buy in, people that are not willing to change the way that they've been doing business for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and then people in the organization with the same type of mindset. The accidents never happened to me, so why should I apply this new methodology? Why should I change what I do and how I do it? So that brings me to my next question. How do we communicate to our clients? What is the message that we give to our clients that looking after the employees as their most valuable asset is the right thing to do? And in that same sense as well, not doing so leads to a lot of liability.
That is a very valid question and a very valid topic to actually discuss, Ockert. So if we if I were to go to any employer and I would ask that person, should we take your whole workforce away here now? What would happen?
Well, nothing. Nothing. I mean, nothing's going to happen. There's going to be no production unless everything's mechanized, but who's going to maintain the machines? Who's going to run the accounts? So what do you do?
That's correct. So who's the asset there? So the employee is a very valuable asset in that regard, because without the employees, there's nothing going on at your organization. So productivity will obviously be non-existent. You won't be able to get income. So how would you then look after your employees if they are not your valuable asset? So from a liability aspect, yes, you do get clients that says that, nothing ever happened, and how do we then communicate to them? But yes, nothing ever happened, but something could happen. There's always that something could happen. And I mean, if you just look at near misses, those employers might not even be aware of near misses. A near miss leads to an incident. So no employer out there can say for an actual fact that nothing ever happened, because maybe they were not seen. So in that regard, we would communicate to the employer that it is important to have a look at these policies, get the approval, sign them off, get the responsibilities out there so that you can look after your most valuable asset, your employee.
So in your experience then, what would you say is the most effective way to prioritize employee safety and well-being within your client's organization? Okay.
So thanks so much for that. We spoke a lot about the policies, the procedures, and the practices. Thank you, Eric, for that. We would then delve into your risk assessment. If we look at the risk assessment, we need to look at how can your employees actually get injured, by the tasks that they performed, and then how are we as employers going to actually create a safe space for them to work. And if we look at prioritizing the employee safety, have a look at what your highest tasks or your highest risk tasks and activities are. So if you operate a forklift, or if you've got reach trucks, or if you've got machines that rotate and that could potentially cause an injury, have a look at those and really go and delve deep in your risk assessment and see if you were to use that equipment, how would you want to keep yourself safe? And then prioritize the effectiveness, or prioritize the controls, and then monitor the effectiveness thereof.
Eric, so if we take JD's answer into account, what steps would you recommend from your experience should be taken to prevent accidents and incidents in the workplace? Thinking about policies, procedures and practices, and keeping those in mind, which steps would you recommend?
Thanks, okay. Well, just to compliment Jay on his answer as well there, I love the fact that he implemented and brought in the perspective of the risk assessment. I mean, that's the heart of your system at the end of the day. And what I could pick up from what JD said as well is that you don't do a risk assessment and get it over and done with. That's a continuous document that you use. You work on it at a daily basis. So if you look at your risk assessment, the steps that we normally follow is get your risk assessment done. That's the heart of your system. Once you start doing the risk assessment, obviously there's different steps that a person follow within that perspective. And that is by identifying your risks and your hazards. The person obviously needs to just identify what is happening. Identify the tasks, identify your risk and your hazards, and then look at identifying your control measures as well. Now, the nice thing about the control measures is you get legislative requirements that you need to include in your control measures, and then you get recommended controls that you can implement. Recommended obviously covers the legislative aspects as well, but that's your step further into the right direction. And what we normally would recommend is let's do that risk assessment, identify the risks and the hazards, get those control measures identified. There's your risk assessment. After that, the next step would be the implementation aspect of it then. So now those control measures that you identify, and that's why I brought up the fact that it's not only a document that you complete, place in the file, let it get dust. After that, you're done. You need to work on that risk assessment because your implementation needs to come out of that risk assessment. So that is then where a person goes over on the implementation aspect of it. And you look at those control measures, implement.
What about the human aspect in this regard? 80% of the accidents that happen at work are due to unsafe acts. Anybody that studied health and safety would know that. So if we implement the hierarchy of control, engineering, substitution, administrative controls, the whole shebang, there's still a person that has to do the job at the end of the line. How do you control that?
How do you control
the person's behavior? Because in essence, he still has to make use of the control measures that you implemented in the steps you just mentioned. How do you change that?
Get them involved in the task. Get them, when you're conducting that risk assessment, when you're identifying that, who at the end of the day, that person has been working on that specific machinery for 4, 5, 6 years. He knows the ins and outs of that machinery, correct? You'll be able to tell you exactly where this machine niggles here, where's the dangerous aspects. Get them involved. Make it an educational process. Because not everyone knows everything in the world. But that person knows that machinery or knows that task that he's conducting in your organization. So make it a facilitation process. Get him involved. Work with them to identify those risks. And at the end of the day, I do believe that that person will feel appreciated. You just ask them what to do, what to focus on. That will have an effect. After that, communication of the risk assessment plays immense as well. Getting the person aware of what the company is looking at implementing, what you're looking at doing to keep him safe during that task. I'm not going to say it's going to solve the whole problem at first, but educating him over a while with the controls, implementing the controls, definitely benefit.
I suppose also, going back to the question with regards to good corporate governance, governance in itself as a whole has to make room for where the system fails or where the person fails to adhere to the rules the system has laid down. And policies and procedures for those instances should also be in place. And those might now relate to other fields such as your industrial relations, where disciplinary actions need to be taken to remove the person from the organization or the department because they present a danger to themselves or to others as well, which is an area where nobody would like to go. But from what you've seen in the workings that you've had with your clients, can you provide an example of how implementing health and safety policies have prevented injuries and incidents at an organization? And please don't name the organization. Obviously, we don't have their permission. I don't know who you're going to talk about, but can you provide an example of such a situation where that was a success?
Yeah, no, definitely. Okay. We've had multiple projects, multiple clients over the course of the years. And luckily, a few big organizations where there was 0 lost time injuries for that whole year period. I'm talking about staff complements of between 1,000 to 1,500. And at the end of the day, the policies and procedures that you implement, the biggest aspect that I saw about it is the culture aspect. That policy that gets signed off on top makes the person already that's working on the floor where the tacky hits the tar, it makes that person feel appreciated. And that is what policies does at the end of the day. Obviously, there are going to be sometimes some aspects that a person doesn't like on the policy, but as soon as a person educates them and he sees that the rest of the organization is abiding to this, that's going to have an effect. So at the end of the day, one of the big positives that I would say this policies and procedures promotes to your organization is the impact of the culture on the organization, getting everyone to work together. It's like myself and Jay reiterated as well, is just going to work and you're going to be safe at the end of the day. That is going to make you work safer. It's going to make you more positive. And that's what the policies and procedure does. It makes a person feel safer.
Eric, I like actually what you mentioned there. If I can interject, sorry. If we look at the health and safety policies that you spoke about, and you spoke about the health and safety culture, what I would like to add is that the practices actually looks at the behavior aspect in the workplace. So what are the good behaviors that we want to see in the workplace? And that obviously plays a big role in the implementation of the health and safety policy. So if those good behaviors are then enforced, we are actually creating good safety habits. And then through that, we influence those mindsets to create the health and safety culture. That's important to note.
I also think an aspect that stood out now in Eric's answer is the fact that he mentioned everybody needs to be involved. If you're going to have, call them late adopters or persons that are laggards that don't necessarily want to adopt the new way of doing things or the correct way of doing things, it makes it really, really challenging. And in the same instance, when it really goes wrong, it's going to lead to liabilities. The accidents happen. So, JD, if I can ask you, how does enforcing these policies reduce these liabilities for employers?
Thank you, Ockert. That's a very interesting question. If we look at the liabilities, there's a couple of different liabilities that one needs to think of. One of them is your criminal liability, and the other one is your civil liability. So if we delve into criminal liability, your policy would give you a guideline in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act in the implementation of that said part of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So your policy provides your guideline and is basically your proof that you want to implement that set of the OSH Act. So if you've got the policy and it's implemented, then from a liability aspect, it would go a little bit better if the Department of Employment and Labour comes out and does an investigation if there is an incident. So they would see that you've got records of the policy, they would see that you've got records of communication, they would see you've got records and the willingness to actually adhere to the requirements of the Act. If you don't have those set policies, they could potentially write out a contravention notice where they give you 60 days to actually sort out the issue at hand. Or they can go further and they can actually give you a prohibition notice. And that's a serious one. Because if you don't have a health and safety policy or procedure on operating a forklift, they could shut your operation of operating a forklift down. So which means there's no productivity. So it's got serious consequences.
I suppose it goes back to, if I hear you correctly, it goes back to common sense. But you know, I've learned a long time ago, common sense isn't common enough. So it's a bit of a catch-22 in that regard. I also think if we look at the future, especially in the South African context, with a change in legislation that's coming, and the criminal liability and the penalties that comes with it, with that new bill that's been suggested and that we're waiting to see it promulgated. Maybe it's what we need for people to take occupational health and safety a little bit more seriously. Maybe it's what we need for people to start really considering, asking the question about what is my health and safety culture in my company? What can we do? What have we neglected? What should we do differently? What should we think about differently? And I think that creates a whole range of opportunities and a whole new world, if you can call it that, that will be explored hopefully in the near future. Because as I said, I think it's maybe about time that, in the South African context, that a lot of people start waking up to the seriousness of the things that they're not considering and how others are getting hurt by those decisions or lack of making decisions. I want to thank you, Eric and JD, for joining us today. It was an insightful session. For you, the viewer, if you have any questions with regards to the information we discussed today, please leave a comment below and remember to subscribe to the channel.